Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, it was General Hines, and then Lockheed, fired one of their guys. I think his name was Crawford, or I can't remember.
Well, in that period, they allegedly they made 600 or so major changes, major and minor changes to the plane, and before then, one of the biggest running concerns up to that point was the weight. It's too weighty. It was
Mm-hmm.
too heavy. This was creating a lot of avionic problems, and they shaved off 2,700 pounds or something. And the program was
It's
put
pretty
back.
good.
Yeah,
to their
pretty
credit.
good. I mean, I'll give it to Lockheed. They did a good job, and okay, there's problems with this. We got to figure it out. And you had mentioned that on some piece of software on the helmet, they ended up just going with a less complex version. Was there a lot of that in that 2 year time period where they just said, we'll just go with
Simplify.
a less complex version of X, and then they did that for 600 things to try and bring the weight down, bring the cost down.
That's a good question.
Well, the weight came down to the F-35B, which has really been the problem child of the
Why
whole
don't they just tell the
program.
Marines to use the fucking Harrier? I mean, I don't get it, dude.
Why did Marines need
Use the F-22, use the Harrier,
why
and
did the
you're good.
Marines need their own planes? Is something we should also ask. Why cannot we
The
have
inter-service dynamics of that get crazy.
we have an integrated warfighting military. That's what combat at arms is all about. You use all the branches together, and that's how you fight a war. I don't understand
but
why
that only really works if they don't see each other as their primary enemies.
I just don't get it. I've never understood why the Marines of all people, and why not the Army? Why does the Army not get their own?
Big egos.
Yeah.
Colonel Jessup's, I guess.
I mean, these were like political battles that were settled in literally in like the late 40s as far as who got what capabilities.
1947.
Yeah, and even going so far as like the relative budget proportions haven't really changed since the early 50s, I believe.
And that's one thing I was talking about earlier is like this blows my mind that the Marine Corps got to drive the requirements of this aircraft. Like, as I've said before, like this aircraft would look a whole lot more like the F-22 if it hadn't been for the Marine Corps. I mean, that lift fan has been a huge, weight restriction. Not only that, but
did the Chinese, when they stole all the plans, did they go with that or did they skip it?
What's that?
I mean, the Chinese version of this thing looks the same. It's like, it reminds me of the Soviet version of the space shuttle. It's like the same airframe.
J-11?
A-32,
something like that.
Yeah. Well, one thing about the Soviets, you're talking about the Buran and the space shuttle. Yeah, I mean, it was a hell of a lot better than, it did do flights. And, the space shuttle was basically a low, high orbit flying death trap, basically.
Well, but it actually flew. The Buran never left the ground. I mean, there's literally like a shell of a hangar that has like an old one in it, but it's useless.
It flew, I think, 2 times back in 1988.
They probably tested it, but my point is
it was no people on board.
Yeah,
but
anyway, but
yeah,
I was asking about the lift fan. Did the Chinese put it in theirs?
No, I think they did the A model. The Air Force model.
There you go. So that just shows you, if you got this is sort of what I was going to say about the Marines and the U.S. government as a whole. U.S. government's a clusterfuck. I mean, it's not like the communist governments, or we don't have any alternatives to communism or capitalism apparently, but you know what I mean. It's a democracy, and so when Trump got in, everybody's like, oh, the wall, and the liberals were legitimately scared. Oh, the wall. Oh no, we can't get slave voters anymore to the United States to vote for our evil party, but it doesn't work that way. I mean, there are factions and groups that have way more power than you might think. And so this is just another example of that. It's just the Marines. I wouldn't know that, but apparently they run a lot. I mean, Mattis came from the Marines. He was the defense secretary. There's a slight clue, but it's it's interesting, and they tough talk, and they have a big reputation of being like the tough guys, and so I'm sure that has a lot of weight. And it's not like, you know, where the Chinese Communist Party, Xi Jinping, he's basically the dictator, and so if a decision
they
is
have
made,
their own factional politics,
of
they
course,
have their own,
of course,
their own imperatives going on. Like the People's Liberation Army, they were still running, like, you know, factories making furniture and all sorts of random grifts all up and down. The difference seems to be just, I mean, by virtue of the size of the U.S. Defense budget, I mean, dwarfing the rest of the world combined, I think.
You say that, but the Chinese are projected to actually outpace it in 20 years or so. Maybe 30 years.
Yeah, that's difficult to project out that far, and it's also difficult to get relative costs. Like it's an American tradition to get filthy, stinking rich selling stuff to the government, going all the way back to the Revolutionary War. That's just ingrained into American culture, and when you don't have any realistic peer competitors and you're developing this one thing that's supposed to be one thing to all people, it's like it's a case of the worse the better. The more contradictory requirements you can layer on this thing, the worse it does, which, because there's no alternative, means there's a lot of opportunities to fix things. Like, all of this stuff is just an endless money funnel, which explains why there's so many nice McMansions in Northern Virginia.
What was the reaction within Lockheed to initially a lot of the complaints about the F-35 and a lot of the feedback that the plane was getting from the military and from the government?
I can tell you I mostly worked with the supply chain type of people, the logistics officers, and the senior NCOs with the program. Had very little interaction with the pilots at the squadron level, but they hated it. I mean, they hated it. They had a program that was called Nalcomas, which is basically like DOS prompt. I mean, but it worked for them. I mean, you needed a part, you could work it. And then supposedly we've got this great system called Alice that, could like read the plane and, know exactly what needed to be done. They hated it. The people that had to do the grunt work absolutely hated that plane and put me in a really bad position as the representative from the company, that had to keep these guys satisfied, with the program. And I mean, it was costing them, a lot of extra man hours, and, we didn't know if the plane was going to work or not. There was just no way to really find that out. And, with the legacy programs, like I was at Yuma base, Marine Corps Air Station Yuma, and they were flying the AV-8B, and that sucker is a really technical plane to fly. It's really hard to do, but they still did it, even with these 1970s technologies. And it was just downright embarrassing that, I was here and this plane was a maintenance nightmare. It was a supply chain nightmare. You didn't know what, parts to bring out. I mean, every plane that flew out to Yuma had to go through depot maintenance. And depot maintenance is something that you usually do. You usually send it to a specific base. You had to send it to like a special base to like retrofit it. You had to have really skilled people. And that's why I was there. I had to go through.
But why are you so far away from the production floor? Why do you have to be all the way at the Marine Corps base? Why can't you be at the factory fixing it, and then before they ship it off even? It makes no sense to me. Couldn't you communicate to the factory that you guys need to fix this before you send it to us, and then, or you go over there?
No, yeah, that would make sense to you and me, Like, go ahead and fix it before it flies off.
So, I mean, look, this is a basic manufacturing principle. The longer you wait to fix something, the more expensive it gets. The earlier you catch it, the cheaper it is.
If you fuck up, you're supposed to fix it as the manufacturer.
No, but like, yeah, that would be the same the same, warranty type of operation that you would have, like with a car. But again, you're talking about changes that have to be made on the plane. You have to contract those out, and they might be, in some of the cases that I was doing, 7 years out. Like, you have to do it. Like, this was the contract specification. We have to build it this way, and we're going to get paid for it, and we're going to ship it out. And that's one of the things that's really becoming a major issue with this program is, yeah, they're selling these aircraft, but, when they have the flyaway cost, they're always talking about, the flyaway cost. It's the DD-214 or DD-250 process where you have, basically, an American civil servant, that buys off on the program. And they buy that aircraft based upon that contract. But that contract might be like 5 or 6 years old. So, I mean, that's basically what happens.
So the issue is that, like, the requirements are obsolete, or?
Yes, basically, I mean, they are building these aircraft, with requirements that are 5 or 6 years old, and they're buying them, and they're going to have to spend, X amount of dollars to retrofit them. But they met the requirements, and they can DD-250 them out to the U.S. government. So, like, when Lockheed is talking about, like, we've reduced the cost from $110 million down to $80 million. Well, that doesn't keep it, account all the retrofits and the, depot maintenance that you have to do, which is extremely expensive. You have to completely retrofit that aircraft, to get them up to cost or get them up to, specification. It does not keep it. No.
This would absolutely not fly not to make a pun, but this would not fly at all in a lot of the private sector, especially when you're dealing with manufacturing, or if you're putting out software. If I put out software for a client and I told them, by the way, the libraries that I put in that software, all the binary files, are 5 years old, and you're going to have to fix that. And then I go and tell my executive committee that, in fact, cost of making that software has gone down, and we're in the black on this. If I was then found out to have done that, I would be fired. I'd probably be sued. My reputation would be totally destroyed. I'd probably not work for at least a year, and I have to take a shitty job doing web dev work, like a fifth grader, for $5 an hour in India. That's how bad it would be if I did something like that.
But your clients have options.
Right.
So if you hearken back to markets that are kind of a monopoly, like AT&T back in the day, or IBM for certain markets back in the day, or even when you have extreme vendor lock-in, like you're all in on the Oracle train, you do end up with situations like that where they're like, Oracle, that's a cool story, but consult the contract, and if you want to switch away from us, it's going to cost you several $1 million. So I suggest that you just pay for the changes.
Yeah, to be fair, this happens in the private sector too. It's typically from big companies where there's not a lot of options.
It does happen, yes, but
we get your point.
The ability to get away with it is, I think, much more difficult.
Yeah,
and I at some level, you should look at this almost like accounting fraud that Lockheed is basically committing,
And I'm sure that if there was an
they actually were committing literal accounting fraud early in the program. If you watch the
really?
Nova special on the fly-off between Boeing and Lockheed, Lockheed basically didn't account for $100 million of spending